January 11, 1944 did not begin as a turning point. Over central Germany, it looked like just another routine interception. One more repetition of a pattern the Luftwaffe believed it fully understood. American bombers were once again pushing eastward, their formation stretching across the winter sky, heading toward industrial targets near Brunswick and Oschersleben. For German fighter pilots, this scenario felt familiar, almost predictable. They had intercepted bomber streams like this dozens of times before. Bf-109s and FW-190s climbed steadily, forming up at altitude with practiced precision. The strategy was simple and proven. American escort fighters would protect the bombers only part of the way. Once fuel limits were reached, the escorts would turn back toward England. That moment, the brief window when the bombers were exposed, was when German fighters struck. For months, this tactic had worked. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings were tough, well-armed aircraft, but they simply could not stay with the bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe had built confidence on this reality. October 1943 had been especially brutal for the Americans. The Schweinfurt raids alone cost dozens of bombers in a single day, reinforcing the belief that deep penetration missions were unsustainable. German pilots climbed that morning expecting the same sequence. Escorts turned back, bombers left vulnerable, attack, disengage, escape. As expected, the familiar silhouettes of American escorts began to peel away. The German fighters moved in, preparing to strike the bomber formations. Everything was unfolding exactly as it always had, until something appeared in the sky that did not belong in the script. Something new was waiting for them. If this moment stands out to you, leave a comment with A or share what caught your attention most. As the German pilots closed in, they noticed shapes cutting through the sky that didn't match anything they were trained to expect. These fighters weren't bulky like the P-47 Thunderbolt, nor did they have the distinctive twin-boom silhouette of the P-38 Lightning. What they saw instead were sleek single-engine aircraft with long noses, smooth wings, and clear bubble canopies that offered unmatched visibility. For a brief moment, confusion replaced confidence. These aircraft were flying where no American fighters were supposed to be, deep over Germany, still escorting the bombers. They were P-51 Mustangs. At first, the German pilots assumed the same rules applied. New fighter type, same limitation. The Americans would engage briefly, burn fuel, then break away and head home. That assumption shaped the opening maneuvers. German fighters pressed in, expecting the Mustangs to behave like every escort before them. But the P-51s did not turn back. Equipped with external drop tanks, the Mustang possessed a range that German intelligence had not fully grasped. These fighters could escort bombers far beyond the old limits, remain over the target area, and still have enough fuel to fight aggressively. For the first time in the air war, American bombers were no longer temporarily protected. They were covered all the way in, and all the way out. The realization didn't come instantly. It emerged slowly, maneuver by maneuver. The Mustangs stayed close. When German pilots tried to draw them into short engagements, they didn't disengage. When they attempted to climb away or reposition, the P-51 stayed with them. This was not a brief escort presence. This was permanence. What German pilots were encountering wasn't just a new aircraft. It was a collapse of an assumption they had built their entire interception doctrine around. If this shift surprised you, write in the comments what you think the German pilots felt in that moment. As the fight developed, the true danger of the Mustang became impossible to ignore. The P-51 wasn't just present. It was fast. At high altitude, the P-51B could reach speeds of around 440 miles per hour, faster than both the Bf-109G and the FW-190A in level flight above 20,000 feet. More importantly, it could hold that speed. Its Packard-built Merlin engine delivered consistent power without overheating or fading during extended combat. German pilots quickly realized their usual escape tactics no longer worked. For years, disengagement had been their safety valve. If a fight turned unfavorable, they would dive away at high speed, trusting gravity and engine limits to carry them out of danger. Against earlier American fighters, this worked. The P-51 changed that equation completely. When German fighters dove to escape, the Mustangs followed. They did not fall behind. They did not peel off. They stayed in pursuit, matching speed and control all the way down. The realization was terrifying. There was no longer a guaranteed way out. One German pilot, Oberleutnant Heinz Knocke of Jagdgeschwader 11, later described his first encounter with the new American fighter in his diary. He wrote that the engagement began normally but quickly turned unsettling. Every maneuver was mirrored. Every attempt to disengage was countered. The American fighters remained glued to them, down through altitude layers where earlier escorts would have vanished. The Mustang wasn't invincible. German fighters still had strengths. The FW-190 retained an excellent roll rate, and a skilled pilot in a Bf-109 could still fight effectively. But raw performance was only part of the story. What mattered most was endurance, the ability to stay in the fight, refuse to leave, and deny the enemy escape. In the skies over Germany that day, German pilots began to understand something deeply unsettling. Survival was no longer guaranteed by disengagement alone. If this part hit you, comment one word that describes this moment for the German pilots. January 11, 1944 marked more than the arrival of a new aircraft. It marked the collapse of an entire way of fighting. For nearly 2 years, the Luftwaffe had controlled the rhythm of air combat over Germany. German pilots decided when to attack, when to disengage, and when to live to fight another day. If conditions turned unfavorable, they simply broke away and escaped. That freedom had defined air superiority. The P-51 Mustang erased that freedom. For the first time, American fighters could pursue German aircraft for as long as fuel and ammunition allowed. Disengagement no longer meant safety. It meant exposure. German pilots who attempted to break off discovered that the Mustang stayed with them, shadowing every turn, dive, and climb. Retreat became dangerous. Escape became uncertain. This change forced an immediate psychological shift. German pilots were trained and conditioned to believe in technical and tactical superiority. Luftwaffe propaganda reinforced the idea that German engineering and pilot skill gave them a decisive edge. But over central Germany, that belief was suddenly challenged by reality. The enemy could now stay. And staying changed everything. The 304th Fighter Group, flying P-51Bs, escorted the 8th Air Force's bombers on that mission. The results shocked German fighter units. Engagements that once favored the interceptors now tilted toward the escorts. The Mustang proved faster at altitude, strong in dives, and capable of turning tightly enough to stay competitive against the Bf-109. The only consistent advantage German fighters retained was roll rate, and roll rate alone could not guarantee survival. Air combat was no longer about choosing favorable moments. It became a constant contest of endurance, positioning, and pressure. The skies over Germany had turned hostile for those who once dominated them. If this shift in control stands out to you, leave a comment sharing what you think mattered more here. Speed, range, or psychology. The consequences of that single change spread rapidly across the entire air war. Before the Mustang, American bomber losses on deep missions into Germany averaged between 5 and 10% per operation. Those numbers were devastating. At a 10% loss rate, the statistical chance of a bomber crew surviving a full tour of 25 missions was almost non-existent. Crews knew it. Commanders knew it. The strategy itself was under threat. The P-51 changed those numbers. With continuous escort all the way to the target and back, bomber losses dropped to an average of 2 to 4% per mission. Still dangerous, still deadly, but now survivable. Crews had a realistic chance of coming home after completing their tours. What had once been a gamble bordering on suicide became a brutal but sustainable campaign. For the Luftwaffe, the situation moved in the opposite direction. German fighter losses rose sharply in early 1944. In January alone, approximately 280 fighters were lost on the Western Front. In February, that number climbed past 350. By March, monthly losses exceeded 450 aircraft. These were not isolated spikes. They were the beginning of a trend the Luftwaffe could not reverse. German factories were producing more aircraft than ever before, but production numbers hid a fatal weakness. Pilots were irreplaceable. Training hours were shrinking as fuel shortages and time pressures increased. New German pilots in 1944 were often sent into combat with barely 160 hours of flight training. Just 2 years earlier, that number had been closer to 300. Across the Channel, American pilots arrived with more than 400 hours of training before seeing combat. The Mustang did not create this imbalance, it exposed it. If this contrast in numbers surprised you, comment what statistic hit you the hardest. The experience gap in the skies became lethal. In theory, a skilled German pilot in a Bf-109 could still challenge a P-51 on relatively equal terms. The Mustang was not a miracle weapon that guaranteed victory in every engagement. But theory depended on experience, and experience was exactly what Germany was losing. As veteran Luftwaffe pilots were killed or worn down, they were replaced by younger men rushed through shortened training programs. Many arrived at the front having barely mastered formation flying, let alone high-altitude combat against aggressive escorts. When these inexperienced pilots met seasoned American Mustang pilots, the outcome was brutally one-sided. The P-51 exploited this gap without mercy. American pilots had the advantage of speed, endurance, and superior situational awareness, but above all, they had confidence. They knew they could stay in the fight. They knew they could pursue. German pilots, especially the new ones, entered combat already aware that escape was no longer guaranteed. This imbalance transformed individual dogfights into attritional slaughter. Losses mounted not because German aircraft were poorly designed, but because the men flying them were outmatched in training, time, and tactical freedom. Each lost pilot further weakened the Luftwaffe's ability to resist future raids. At the same time, American fighter doctrine evolved. No longer limited by range, P-51 units were free to abandon purely defensive escort patterns. Instead of flying tightly around bomber formations, Mustang groups began to roam ahead, searching for German fighters before they could even reach interception altitude. The mission was no longer just protection. It was domination. If this shift toward aggressive tactics stood out to you, share your thoughts in the comments. With the arrival of the Mustang, the roles in the air war reversed. American fighters were no longer waiting to react. They became hunters. P-51 groups began flying aggressive fighter sweeps, pushing far ahead of bomber formations to intercept German fighters as they climbed to attack. Instead of defending against assaults, they prevented them. This forced German pilots into a constant state of vulnerability. Fighters climbing toward bomber streams now had to scan the skies above them, aware that Mustangs could already be there, fast, patient, and fully fueled. The advantage of surprise vanished. The initiative shifted entirely to the Americans. German countermeasures proved ineffective. The Luftwaffe attempted to mass large formations of fighters, hoping to overwhelm escorts through sheer numbers. But assembling those formations took time. Time that allowed P-51s to strike while German units were still forming up. Concentration became a liability instead of a strength. Standing patrols were tried next. Fighters were positioned along likely bomber routes, ready to intercept. But Mustangs simply chased them off or destroyed them outright. With the ability to pursue indefinitely, American fighters denied German units the ability to hold airspace. Any position could be challenged. Any retreat could be punished. The psychological toll mounted quickly. German pilots learned that survival now depended on avoidance rather than engagement. Many refused combat unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. This was rational, even necessary, but it meant surrendering control of the skies. Bombers passed through with less resistance. Cities burned with increasing regularity. The hunter had become the hunted. If this reversal of roles stood out to you, comment what you think mattered more, initiative or endurance. Germany's technical answer came too late. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter entered limited service near the end of 1944, promising a dramatic leap in performance. It could outrun the P-51 with ease and carried firepower capable of destroying bombers in seconds. On paper, it looked like salvation. In reality, it was not. Production delays, fuel shortages, and constant mechanical problems crippled the program. Worse still, strategic interference diverted the aircraft into roles it was never meant to fill. Only a few hundred Me-262s ever reached combat units, and far fewer were operational at any given time. Against thousands of Mustangs filling the skies, it made little difference. The deeper damage inflicted by the P-51 went beyond aircraft losses. German pilots who survived encounters with Mustangs adapted by avoiding combat whenever possible. Engagements were broken off early. Interceptions were abandoned at the first sign of American fighters. Survival took precedence over defense. This adaptation made sense on an individual level, but strategically it was disastrous. Avoiding combat meant conceding airspace. Bombers flew with fewer challenges. Industrial centers were struck again and again. By the spring of 1944, there was effectively no part of Germany beyond American reach. The Luftwaffe was still fighting, pilots were still flying, aircraft were still being built. But the battle had shifted from resistance to endurance, and Germany was running out of both. If this moment felt inevitable to you, leave a comment sharing your perspective. The numbers told a story no propaganda could hide. In 1943, the 8th Air Force lost roughly 1,850 heavy bombers over Europe. The cost was staggering, and every loss echoed through airfields across England. Yet in 1944, despite flying far more missions and striking deeper into Germany than ever before, bomber losses rose only slightly, to around 2,100 aircraft. The tempo had increased dramatically, but survivability had improved. German losses moved in the opposite direction. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 2,400 fighters on the Western Front. In 1944, that number exploded to more than 6,000. This was attrition on a scale Germany could not absorb. Aircraft could be built. Pilots could not. Veteran German pilots who encountered the Mustang in early 1944 later described those first battles as moments of clarity. Not defeat in a single day, but certainty of an eventual outcome. The Americans had solved the escort problem. They now had a fighter that could go anywhere, fight anyone, and stay for as long as necessary. One German pilot who survived the war wrote that seeing Mustangs remain with the bombers all the way to the target changed everything. It meant there would be no safe zones, no pauses, no recovery periods. Every mission would be fought over German cities, German factories, German homes. The air war continued for many months after January 11, 1944. Battles were still fought, lives were still lost. But from that moment on, the balance no longer shifted. It only moved in one direction. If this realization resonates with you, comment what you think truly ends wars. Technology, training, or persistence. January 11, 1944 did not end the air war over Europe. The Luftwaffe would continue fighting for another 16 months. German pilots would still rise to intercept, and American bombers would still face danger. But the outcome was decided in the cold skies over central Germany that day. When German fighters climbed expecting the familiar pattern, escorts turning back, bombers left exposed, they encountered a new reality. The P-51 Mustang did not leave. It stayed with the bombers all the way to the target. It stayed when German fighters tried to disengage. It stayed when escape had once been guaranteed. With a range of over 1,600 miles using drop tanks, a top speed of around 440 miles per hour at altitude, and maneuverability that matched or exceeded German fighters, the Mustang erased every advantage the Luftwaffe once relied on. Timing, control, disengagement, all were gone. The P-51 did not win the air war through revolutionary technology. It was not a radical design. It was a refined, balanced aircraft built around a single, decisive idea: range. The ability to go anywhere and remain there. German pilots understood immediately what that meant. They could keep fighting, but they could no longer control the sky over their own country. The Americans could reach any target. Every mission would be contested. Every retreat would be dangerous. That is why the P-51 Mustang became the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe, not in a single battle but through relentless pressure that could not be escaped. If this story gave you a new perspective on air warfare, leave your thoughts in the comments and share what moment stood out most to you.